Well, I have the pleasure to moderate this panel on decarbonizing the supply chain. And I think I cannot imagine a better group of people to discuss this topic. So we have Paul from Maersk. Oh, Peter, excuse me.
Paul has become Peter.
Yeah,
Paul has
become
Peter.
Yeah, so we have Andreas from Amazon, and I'm really keen because there's so many questions I always wanted to ask Amazon, so be prepared.
Thank you.
And we have Mark from A-Climate, from a startup, so representing the challenger side today. So maybe before we go into the discussion, why at all, do we discuss about decarbonization of the supply chain? I think all of us, we live in a world of, we want to have all goods instantly wherever we are. And if you imagine 80% of all goods were at one stage containerized, so somewhere in the world flowing around. So just commercial transportation is accounting for over 10% of the carbon emissions. So this is really, of course, significant. And in order to somehow, decarbonize, of course, first thing is that you need to understand how the supply chain is really working, where are the emissions occurring. And unfortunately, it's not the case, because most companies have outsourced their logistics and have no transparency at all. Some of them, or most of them actually, I think 67%, are using spreadsheets and Excel as their supply chain management tool. And there is 500,000 logistics companies out there trying, to handle all those goods back and forward. So bringing in transparency and connecting the supply chain, I think, is key. And so I'm from Speed Invest. I'm from the venture capital side. And of course, we look where there is food for disruption. And therefore, we are investing a lot also in the supply chain side of things. The investments have doubled from 2020 to 2021, accounting now for $27 billion that is running into supply chain startups. So all kind, from transparency platforms, visibility platforms, there is, of course, blockchain technology outside, dynamic demand forecasting, and technology definitely is there now to support. And so therefore, I'd love to start as you are responsible. Actually, I think you are a founding partner of Maersk Growth. How are you collaborating with startups? Where can they help in the decarbonization game? There was in CB Insights a big map of unbundling Maersk from the startup side. So keen to learn how you do that, and maybe you also have an example for us.
Sure. So I think the first thing to say is that's good news for all the startups and founders out there, that startups essentially are an essential part of actually achieving anything of what we want to achieve. They are much better at identifying problems, solutions, and so forth, but might have slightly more challenges in terms of scaling certain things. And I think within decarbonization, the core of the challenge is a hardware challenge. Software is an element of it, but if you look at other disruptions that's happened over the last many years, here we really have a big chunk of hardware. And hardware is difficult. It's difficult to develop. It takes time. It requires a lot of patience from investors, what some might not have. And there I think actually corporate investors can play a role jointly with VCs and so forth in that particular piece. An example of a company we invested into is called Waste Fuel. They actually take landfills or municipal waste and turn that into green fuels. It's pretty cool getting rid of landfills if you've got some of those lying around. And it's a way of actually making something good out of it. But they have a lot of challenges in sourcing the feedstock, the engineering they need to do, hiring they need to do, and all these things combined with it, they need to raise a lot of capital. So what we're doing is we're helping them with offtake, with both commercial backing, and that way they can actually raise money for building out these hugely expensive infrastructure projects. So I think it's really an important combination of it. And again, hardware is really, really at the core of decarbonization.
So does this mean startups do need corporates in order to succeed? Because usually, venture companies are rather skeptic to invest in hardware.
No, I don't. I mean, I think that would be the wrong conclusion to draw. But I think there's some healthy element in bringing someone in who, jointly with other investors who've actually been running assets for years, who has been part of innovating on a hardware base for years, and who might also have a slight more patience, especially again on some of those situations needs to be done. I think it'll be foolish to have a complete 100% corporate funding of it, because then I think you're missing a little bit of the that the VCs should put into it. So a healthy combo of different aspects and knowledge around the table.
Okay. So looking at the startup side of things, how easy is it to collaborate with the corporates?
Yeah, so I guess I should probably just introduce myself and Acclimate briefly before I jump into that question. So yeah, I'm Mark Fischel. I'm obviously the founder of Acclimate. Essentially what we do is we help large companies support thousands of their suppliers on their climate journeys. So we provide the platform that they can give out to their suppliers and get them started on measuring their carbon emissions, reducing that over time, and reporting on it. So hopefully that gives you a bit of context. And we are working with 2 of the Fortune 500 right now. But I think if I just had to focus in on sort of one challenge more broadly that startups face when working with corporates in the world of climate is, I think, one of urgency. So I think there's incredible opportunities there when you get a company like Maersk that really does have the executive and the C-suite behind what they're trying to do. Contrary to popular belief, corporates actually can move really quickly and get things done at great scale. But I think what we found quite often is that some of the corporates that we have spoken to, the pledge and the commitment has come somewhat in advance of the transformational shift that is really required to get people to put these things into action quickly and with a sense of urgency that I think the climate emergency demands. So I think that would be the one kind of main challenge. But as I said, I think when the stars are aligned and you get that executive buy-in, things can happen really quickly, and it's really exciting. And we've definitely found that with the clients that we're working with right now.
Okay, so that sounds, the first step that you are doing, just to understand again, is helping to bring in transparency, or
exactly, yeah.
to see who is producing and responsible and accounting for what carbon emissions. That's one thing. How do you get to the data? Do you need the suppliers, to get onto your platform, and how do you motivate them to do so?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. So I think 80% plus or so of corporate carbon emissions are actually in their supply chain, and so a lot of this comes down to like a data challenge. There's no way really to show and track improvements in your supply chain unless you can get primary data from your suppliers. And to your point around incentivization, I think there's a really great opportunity here where typically supply chain engagement has been very top-down audit kind of style. You must do this sort of compliance style, I would say. And I think what we're seeing a shift to, and what's really the next frontier, is shifting from that compliance model really to a more collaborative exercise. Where the corporate buyer actually provides lots of incentives. They ask their suppliers to do this, but then they go a stage further and they provide them with the tooling to make that a reality. So yeah, moving from a compliance style, command and control method, really to collaborating with their suppliers, supporting them, incentivizing them to actually take the first steps. There's all kinds of interesting and novel new approaches. For example, paying your suppliers earlier if they take more onus on their climate journey and so on. So I think, yeah, from our perspective, it's about really incentivizing and driving the value for the suppliers such that they engage with this process.
Great. So that's good to hear that there is mechanism and that there's a shift in mindset.
Absolutely.
I
think actually, yeah, I was going to say, I think, if they do get that right as well, suppliers are getting bombarded from lots of different directions about giving up their carbon emissions, and they're just searching for an opportunity to really put that into practice. So that's what makes me most optimistic, I suppose, is that there is actually demand from the supplier side.
Okay. So maybe, Andreas, to your side. So we've heard one thing is, finding the transparency, trying to integrate, maybe even come to actionable, activities that they jointly can do. But in the end, one of the, I think, most impactful measures would be to reduce transportation and try to source more locally and not to ship one T-shirt around the world for 3 years. So are you incentivizing somehow from Amazon's side that local sourcing is stimulated?
So the driver behind what we are offering as Amazon is, of course, the customer demand. And that is driving also our sourcing decisions, that's driving the selection we are offering. And one of the reasons why we introduced also fairly recently the climate-friendly label is to help the customer making educated decisions what is happening. And of course, when it comes to, in particular, the transportation network, then there's a lot of win-win opportunity by actually reducing distances, making better use of the assets. It helps the climate, and it also helps on the cost side. So it's not always this either-or environment, but they can also very often go well hand in hand. But from my perspective, the transformation we are talking about and what is necessary to make a game change here is just way too slow. We are struggling with the push we get from customers, we get also from our own employees to transform our business to become more carbon friendly. We are struggling to get to the point that we have technology ready for it. So I'm representing what we call the middle mile. That's the long distance transportation across Europe, connecting our network. And on the delivery side, technology is fairly advanced to be carbon neutral, to be net zero carbon with the e-delivery vehicles, trikes, and all of the new things that are happening there. When it comes to the heavy goods vehicle segment, for instance, that's a very different story. And we need to advance faster to have good answers to take the carbon out of the long-distance transportation, because that's a key driver of the carbon footprint in the operations across all of the value chains.
So how can we do that? I mean, how can we, reduce carbon on this long-haul transportation mile? And what are you doing maybe also, with regards to startups that are looking into autonomous and electrification of trucking and those kind of things?
So I would structure this into almost 3 buckets. One is gaining efficiency, which is a lot technology driven. There's the routing piece, making good use of the assets, reducing empty miles by having backloads where there is a one-way load happening on the road, and making sure that this reduces traffic and increases the carbon efficiency part. The second part is helping to overcome what I would call is a chicken or egg dilemma, because many of the suppliers we are talking to, let's say the OEMs, is I don't have a sufficient demand, that's why I cannot produce a more cost-efficient vehicle. And that's why alternative fuels are not taking off as quickly as they can. On the supplier, on the customer side there, or the freight forwarders, including ourselves with our own activities, it's, well, if we can't get a very cost-efficient vehicle, it does make sense to push to move away from diesel or other traditional fossil fuel-based. And so what we as Amazon did is we started to making some very broad commitments and pushing the envelope there, investing in technology others might not do. A perfect example is our order with Rivian a few years back with 100,000 e-delivery vans to ensure that this is truly a transformation, that is no longer do we have a sufficient demand and how can we go for scale. And I want to see more of that. We are working with startups, we are working with the traditional OEMs to find solutions faster. And so a lot of that in the second bucket is about technology. And the third one, I would say, is about partnerships. We have necessity, public-private partnership when it comes, for instance, to providing sufficient infrastructure supply. We have sizable challenges in how we deal with grid capacity if we want to charge fleets, because we are lacking transparency from a regulatory frontier. Where is which level of capacity demanded? And it might have 5 different players at the same time aiming for the same capacity, and then it's already not enough. And a lot of the transformation is not happening because there might even be a vehicle, but we can't charge it if I go for battery electric pieces. Hydrogen is still not as advanced as the battery electric part, but that's another opportunity where I see lots of momentum from the startup scene. But again, we need to make sure we are working on this transformation together. I don't think anybody can go it alone.
So that's interesting. What you're saying is more or less regulation is, at least the one in place, hindering more the, transformation rather than stimulating. So I think everyone is talking these days about carbon border tax and the implication and hopefully stimulation it might have on the sector. And I'd be keen to understand, are you expecting, I think the implementation is now planned for January 26, so everyone needs to be transparent at the point. Are you expecting a big push for your business? And, do you think that is really stimulating a quick adaptation? I mean, question to all of you.
So I think first and foremost, what's quite encouraging, even though it might not look in terms of results that we've achieved in the last few years, the voluntary actions are actually quite well ahead of any kind of regulations. And I think that's stepped up tremendously in the last sort of 18 to 24 months. Won't stay ahead necessarily by not having some regulations, another piece coming behind, but it's also really important that this is an area where not a lot of innovation has been done in the last several decades. So just because you regulate doesn't mean you actually have a solution for some of these things. So regulation will come. It's a natural element of it. We as Maersk has advocated for a carbon tax, but it's also important that you look at the segments, business segments, in a different way. Shipping is international, so there will be players if you, let's say, put taxes on only parts of jurisdictions. There are players who will benefit from not having those taxes, who will both be more competitive and might actually not drive down emissions at all. So it really has to be adopted to the individual segments of business and so forth. But regulation is a natural part of it. But I think stimulating the voluntary actions through keeping that sort of regulation just behind, I think may actually achieve more. Because I think it was, to some of the points that was made in the earlier panel, I would like to work for a company that actually does it because they want to, not because somebody has written a freaking paragraph somewhere.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Peter. I think it's not a binary answer in terms of is regulation helping or is not. It really depends on what we are looking at. I give you a very simple example here from the UK. There is no national capacity map for power in terms of how much is there, and there's no heat map associated to it that I would know where I can actually go for which level of capacity, because even if I get one, it is typically out of date in less than 2 months. That is not helping business decisions because if we individually want to drive change and adaptation, but we are lacking some of that transparency, and that's what we discussed before, then it's not necessarily a good decision we are able to achieve, or then people might stay away from making a decision to go active in the investment because I have a lot of uncertainty what is happening. Or we are running a pan-European network, which means that what matters the most also for the carbon footprint is distance and not so much what is happening in one country and what is happening in the neighboring country. And that can be a very short distance. Cross-border can easily mean it's a difference of 20, 30 miles. And you are actually already dealing with two different implementations of the same regulatory framework in at least the European Union, because it has been translated into very different ways of executing that framework in just two very neighboring jurisdictions. They just happen to be in two different countries. And this is more the part I'm referring to, that there's lots of opportunity. I think we have seen plenty of stimulus from the regulatory side, but I think a lot is happening in the detailed implementation, translating into the executional rules, where we can definitely do better.
I'm not saying coming back to local sourcing, not crossing any borders, because I've done that before, and then he had a very good answer. These small countries that more or less have a border, like Luxembourg and the like. So. But okay, I'm not giving up. I think trying to come to nearshoring is a nice way for all of us to do. So for you, do you think that there will be a change with the introduction?
Yeah, I think so. I think I'm generally a bit more positive about the influence that regulation can have. I think less to do with the practical implementation when it comes live, but more just as a bellwether in that it sort of indicates the direction of travel for corporates and the private sector in general. I think maybe even the carbon border tax is a bit too far away in 2026, but there's a whole acronym soup of different bits of regulation that are coming in the next few years that have definitely had some effect. So things like the EU Supply Chain Act, the CSRD for corporate reporting, TCFD in the UK, lots of different acronyms. But I think the key shift that has had, and I've definitely seen that in the last 18 months, is that Scope 3 emissions, or what you might call indirect emissions that aren't under the direct control of a particular organisation. I think there was a consensus a few years ago that was sort of a nice to have, report on it, maybe you should report on it, but it wasn't compulsory. And I think now the general consensus is that people really have to get their act together with regards to measuring those specific emissions. So I think, the whole suite of those regulations has the effect of sort of mobilizing private sector action as a whole. That would be my feeling.
Great. We have time for a question. If everyone, there is the chance now to ask, these gentlemen here, what you always wanted to ask. There is a question over there.
Thank you. I'm Craig Nelson from Tech UK. We're the trade body for tech companies. I wanted to ask your views on reporting, because you mentioned CSRD and TCFD. How transformative do you think the reporting requirements that we're seeing can be? Is it going to be something just for accountants and for the compliance people, or do you think it can really sharpen minds and drive change across your organizations?
Yeah, I guess that's directed at me. Yeah, I think, to my point, I think certainly the one big shift that the onus on reporting has had is getting a much better emissions inventory and making sure that is kind of auditable, that you can really, the numbers that are being published actually have some source and they're coming from somewhere. So I think whilst reporting is obviously a burden on these larger companies, I think it also does have a catalytic effect on companies. It forces them to put resources onto it, forces them to go out and in my world, go out and actually get primary data from suppliers. And I think, it's a very old adage, but you can't really manage what you haven't measured. It's a really hackneyed phrase, but I think that is really true. You need that data, and you need that data transparency to be able to start prioritizing and focusing your action in the right place and start decarbonising, of course. So yeah, I think to answer your question, reporting requirements, obviously they can go too far, but I think there's still, non-financial reporting still has a long way to go. So yeah, I think yes, in answer to your question.
Do you want to comment on reporting? Because there is, I think it's a mess at the moment.
I absolutely agree that it is a mess because there is a push for plenty of different ways how to do it, but in the end, to have a meaningful business decision basis, we need to go basically back to the true data, what is happening. A lot of the decision making today is based on averages of averages. And even if you're getting a shipment breakdown, what's the carbon footprint? It is nothing but an average consumption on an average distance, on an average vehicle, with an average fuel mix, with an average weight. And this is now then broken down by the denominator of the packages. That is not what I would call a sound decision-making basis, and that's why there's so much effort happening also in the industry directly, independent of reporting standards that are discussed, and that definitely will also be important to actually get to a meaningful decision basis. We need to make carbon part of our decision-making, and it will only be a meaningful part of our decision-making if we are not talking about averages of averages.
Yeah, it's difficult to disagree. I think reporting for the sense of reporting, I mean, listen, we've done financial reporting for 1,000 years. It doesn't mean that you actually have a good company just because you make financial reporting. What means something is you actually have some data to make your decisions on. You measure them up against your targets and say, if I make this decision, I'm going to be behind on my target. If I make this decision, I'm going to be ahead of my target and so forth. Something you can relate back to. Transparency is again, I mean, we made our first sustainability report in 2008. And I can tell you those numbers were certainly not based on anything, right, pretty much. But that's still, we've been refining it. It's still a mess. I mean, there's no magic wand here, right, in that sense.
But do you have, excuse me, do you have a clear playbook on actions year on year, what you are doing in order to, I think you pledged to net zero. So what exactly are you doing? Because I think everyone, said it at one point, but.
Great. I think so that fits into what Mark said earlier on. So when we first went out with our carbon neutral target of 2050, it was end of 2018. We had no plan, no idea. That has been reworked. In January this year, we made it to 2040. We now have targets for 2030. We have, it's more detailed than what we are necessarily publishing and so forth in that sense. But it's very clear. Current management needs to be made liable and responsible for achieving whatever pledge you might have 20 years down the road. Otherwise, I mean, they're all going to be retired by then. And if they're not signing up to that and are not prepared to be a leadership that has responsibility today for something that might be achieved in 20 years from now, I'm sorry, they're not my leader.
Great. We are unfortunately already at the end, but I'd love you to invite, let's say in 5 years from now, what is the sub-headline for your company under the title of decarbonization, decarbonizing the supply chain?
Maersk achieved its 2030 target in 2028 then. Where are we? 27, sorry, the math.
This will sound now very similar, but Amazon achieved shipment zero, which is our 2030 target a couple of years in advance, which means 50% across scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions are gone in all of the outbound supply chain.
Good. I like it.
Acclimate supports 100,000th supplier to measure and reduce and set a target to reduce their carbon emissions. So that's quite a long sub-headline, but.
Okay, that's wonderful. I hope Speed Invest will have, 5 unicorns from climate tech. And with that, we hope we will work all on a better future, a decarbonized one. Thank you so much
Thank you.
for your
Thank you.
time.